I'd like to first off welcome everybody and thank you so much for jumping on this morning to join our second in the webinar series that Colorado Corn is putting on. Just a little bit about Colorado Corn. Colorado Corn makes up two organizations: the Colorado Corn Administrative Committee, which is responsible for overseeing the checkoff dollars and developing markets, outreach, and education for people of Colorado, and the Colorado Growers Association, which is the advocacy and voice of the Colorado corn farmer. So I am Nicholas Koglazier, the Executive Director of Colorado Corn, and it is my pleasure to bring Cary Sifferath from the United States Grain Council to talk about all the good work that the USGC is doing across the world. A brief intro of Cary. Cary Sifferath serves as the Senior Director of Global Programs and for the United States Grains Council, a nonprofit organization that promotes the global use of U.S. barley, corn, sorghum, and related products, including ethanol and distillers' dried grain with solubles, or in our industry known as DDGs. In this capacity, Sifferath is responsible for oversight of the Council's 10 international offices and all worldwide programs. Sifferath has held various positions within the Council for the past 27 years. Besides his current position, he has been Regional Director for the Middle East, Africa, and Europe, China Director, Japan Director, and Southeast Asia Regional Director, among other positions. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Cary, and he's going to talk to us about all things Grain Council and the amazing work that they're doing across the globe on behalf of Colorado and farmers across the states. So Cary, without further ado, welcome.
All right. Well, thanks, Nick. And on behalf of all of the staff here at the U.S. Grain Council, appreciate the opportunity to talk to everybody here today, and greatly appreciate the support that Colorado Corn gives to the U.S. Grain Council, both financially and support in your leadership and your members and staff taking part in our programs. So appreciate that quite a bit. I'll go ahead and share my screen here. Hopefully you can get it into presentation mode here. So hopefully that popped up and everybody can see that. So I'm going to talk, kind of give a Grain Council market update, both on how we're operating in today's COVID-19 world, and touch a bit on what's going on globally in grain market wise and ethanol wise, and then touch on two key markets that are quite important. Obviously all the markets are important, but we'll talk on two big ones here this morning. So to start with, just to point out the Grain Council's mission. Our mission is to develop markets, enable trade, and improving lives as we work to develop export markets for corn, barley, sorghum, and their co-products such as ethanol and DDGS, as Nick mentioned in my introduction here. So how we go about that: we have a global footprint of international offices, which are these orange reverse teardrops across the globe, and as well as we have staff or part-time consultants in some cases that are representing us in certain countries or regions of the world. And so with this global footprint, it allows us to be on the ground and working on behalf of Colorado and all U.S. corn farmers in developing markets. And some of them are regional offices. Our Panama office here covers all of Central and South America, while our Mexico office covers just Mexico. Our Tunisia office, where I spent a little bit of time, about 5 years of my career there, covering Africa, Middle East, and what we do in Europe is covered from our Tunis office. Our newest office in what we're calling our South Asia office, we're still working on getting our approval for our New Delhi office. So our South Asia director is actually operating out of Singapore at the moment, but we're getting very close, and hopefully even in early of 2021, we'll be able to open up our on-the-ground office there in New Delhi. But we do have some staff that have worked for us for a long time that are already located there. And then we have our Asian offices, so our China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and then our Southeast Asia office that covers all of Southeast Asia, as well as Australia and New Zealand, which is based there in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. Just a quick note that, back like starting around the 15th of March, we basically shut down all of our operations globally, had everybody working from home. And that was the case for several months. We've started to reopen some of our office in some certain locations. But even then we've had to take a step back. Like our Korea office was open and now it's kind of quasi opened. Our China office is back open, as is our Taipei, Taiwan office. And even our Washington, D.C. office, I'm actually here in our Washington, D.C. office this morning, but we have very limited staff. I think there's 2 of us here this morning that come on a regular basis here. So, but that kind of leads into my next slide of COVID-19 and how that's affected our programs globally, and even how it's affected what our customers are asking. You know, back in March and even into early April, lots of questions by international customers and even governments asking us, you know, is the U.S. going to remain open? Are we going to be able to continue to ship corn and barley and sorghum and DDGS and ethanol to our international customers? So there are lots of fears and concerns about that. Luckily, grain movement is one thing that's very, very automated and doesn't take a lot of labor, but we along with, in cooperation with USDA, making sure to keep all the logistics and inspection that's needed for moving grain into the export channels open. The Grain Council even worked with some of our members where we put together some videos showing operations on the river and down in New Orleans, even in some rail operations, and then also in looking at being able to continue to load containers. And we do see a fair amount of DDGS and some other products getting exported by containers to show that those operations were up and running. And those videos were put out and translated into several different languages even. In addition to that, Ryan LeGrand, our CEO, wrote letters to pretty much most of the major importers, feed grain importers in our major markets, and even some government contacts. Again, this letter here is one in Japanese, reassuring our good customers globally that the U.S. is and will remain open and will be here to be able to supply your needs, so that our feed grain customers globally didn't have to worry about that. In addition to that, the leadership of the Grain Council wanted to keep moving forward with our strategic focus and our key pillars of our strategic plan that the board, the U.S. Grain Council board, approved it's even 3.5-4 years ago. But to keep moving forward, continuing our worldwide market education programs, shifting and addressing our programs responding to the world market conditions is a great example, just reassuring our customers that yes, we are open for business and will continue to supply grain to the world market. Deploying rapid response capabilities where we needed to provide linkage and service to importers and end users. And I'll talk a little bit and give some examples of that, as well as maximizing the diversity of U.S. Grain Council membership. So making sure that we continue to stay on track with the strategic plan of the U.S. Grain Council. Adapting to change, obviously, you know, since mid-March when the world basically changed, we've adapted quite drastically, I would say. You know, we continued with our trade servicing programs, but a lot of that, or almost all of it, moved to virtual platforms, very similar to what we're doing here this morning. Putting on programs on grain quality, supply and demand programs, videos, all kinds of things. Stayed engaged with governments and industries on trade policy issues. While COVID-19 slowed down or even halted a lot of things, it has not stopped all the various trade policy issues, the biotech issues, a lot of the SPS, the sanitary and phytosanitary issues that we deal with. Those are still there, and in some degrees even growing. And so we've had to find ways to continue to stay engaged with government contacts globally to continue to address those issues. Put together lots of studies to continue to provide market intelligence to our customers around the world. And in many cases, tapping our A team members for valuable expertise and outreach to our international customers. I know Troy Schneider, who's the Middle East, Africa, South Asia A-team lead, has even been called on to help out with some of our programs. So we've been doing that, and we'll continue to use a lot of our valuable members, both on the producer side as well as on the ag business side of things. A huge transition to the virtual world. The Grain Council, this table here lists out several of them that probably needs to be updated. There's been quite a few more even, and this is just looking at about a 2.5 month shot of different programs we've had. But we're almost constantly putting on some type of webinar, everything from one-on-one situations. We had, a key corn, the biggest corn importer in Colombia, wanting to have some very specific training on buying of barges themselves. And so doing those kind of one-on-one trainings to having large programs where we talk about corn quality and corn supply to the entire North Asia region, where we had like over 800 people from Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and China on listening simultaneous in 3 different languages. And even here, the picture in the center, this gentleman in the blue hat, that's Hak-Soo Kim, our South Korea director. This is back in June when South Korea actually started to open up. He actually started doing some face-to-face meetings. This is him actually on top of a Panamax vessel in Incheon port in Korea, addressing some of the issues or questions that the importer had on that. But you can see everybody's up on a small group meeting, but everybody's wearing masks there. South Korea has even taken a little bit of a step back, so Hak-Soo's had to even curtail those kind of face-to-face meetings a bit here now. But even today, as I speak, I think Ryan LeGrand, our CEO, was scheduled to be your speaker, and I had to be a substitute for him. He's actually giving opening remarks and running our virtual ethanol buyers conference that basically started the same time as this program started this morning. And so we have, I think it's over 320 international ethanol buyers that are taking part in that program. Some of them this morning, and then that'll get repeated again this evening for our customers out in Asia. So a lot of these programs we do, even this one here, the Big Asia Corn program we did, that started at 10 o'clock at night Eastern time, so ended a little after midnight. So those kind of adjustments to be able to get out and reach our customers is what we continue to do. On the ethanol program side, we're working quite hard. Ethanol demand here in the U.S. and even internationally, as we'll see here in a second, has taken a little bit of a hit, but we continue to work on market development of ethanol programs and markets globally. Big push on policy development in several different markets. Policy and just as it was a lot of government regulations and policies to change and get the ethanol market open here in the U.S., you're seeing those same types of issues globally. And we'll talk about some of them here coming up. Again, with some of the changing in pricing of ethanol versus gasoline and other aromatics, shifted our focus talking about sustainability and the GHG reductions of ethanol, in addition to the economics of it. Done a huge push on industrial use of market development. We've seen some markets really take off with that. A lot of ethanol going into hand sanitizer and other sanitizing uses that is increased demand in certain markets. Working on food versus fuel issues or monitoring them. Working with our domestic partners and building out those relationships to help develop our ethanol markets globally. And keeping an lookout for unknowns that impact demand and programs, because you never know what is around the corner, whether it's a policy issue in Brazil or China or what that can change the international demand for ethanol. quick look. This shows the ethanol markets for the current marketing year. And we have September through July. We won't get the August numbers until early October, and so we only have right now 11 months of data. You can see overall exports of ethanol are down 11%. And Canada has actually overtaken Brazil as our largest market now. Canada continues to be a good, steady market for U.S. ethanol exports. But even there, it's down a little, 5%. You know, a lot of that just overall fuel demand is similar to what we're seeing here in the U.S. Brazil is a different case. We've had the Brazilians set up a TRQ, a tariff rate quota, for the current quota that ended at the end of August of 198 million gallons. And then after that, bouncing to a 20% import tariff. And they've asked to extend that tariff rate quota for another 90 days, which takes us past the U.S. election. And so Brazil is really holding out. They initially put this tariff rate quota back in 2018. It was supposed to be a year-long ordeal. They renewed it in the summer of 2019. And now here in the summer of 2020, they've extended another 90 days. Lots of discussions back and forth, even president to president level, let alone from USTR and USDA talking on this. You know, Brazil continues to have duty-free access to their exports of Brazilian ethanol into the U.S., mainly the California market, while they continue to put roadblocks to slow down and even we saw basically, I don't think we had any trade in July of ethanol to Brazil. But on top of that, we do have some very strong increasing demand in India. India, that's industrial use only. They only allow domestic ethanol to be blended into fuel. We're working quite heavily, and there's an ongoing trade talks between the U.S. and India that we're hopeful we'll actually see some movement on that before the election. And a big part of that is to open up India's ethanol use, even for imported ethanol, to go to fuel blending. They do have a 10% mandate, but they don't produce enough of their own domestic ethanol to meet that mandate. And so our big push there is for the Indian government to allow, use all your own domestic ethanol for fuel blending, and then what you can't produce, import, open that up for imports. So what's happening now is all the domestic production is going for fuel, but it still isn't enough to meet their 10% blend regulations, and then they import U.S. ethanol for the industrial use of things. The EU-UK market is up a bit, and South Korea is up 7%, and that's again, South Korea doesn't use any ethanol blended into fuel. That's all the ethanol going into South Korea is for industrial. Big push on sanitizing use in South Korea. And then South Korea is redistributing. They're reloading some of that ethanol into smaller vessels that are going out to markets like the Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam. And so South Korea has become an important player to us as we look to use them to help increase U.S. ethanol sales and even redistribution across the Asian market. Several countries expanding their ethanol targets. We see, Canada, and I think even in Ontario looking to expand above what they're currently at. Mexico and China have expanded, although there's some issues there. And we'll talk about the Mexico one in more detail here. Vietnam has increased their ethanol blend rate and such. And even Japan on the GHG regulations to allow corn-based ethanol for ETBE production. So Japan uses ethanol in the form of ETBE. We work quite heavily. Before, it was only Brazilian ethanol that could be used to make ETBE, even though it's all made in Houston by Lyondell. They were literally importing Brazilian ethanol into Houston, turning it into ETBE and shipping it to Japan. Now, with the policy change, we can see that U.S. ethanol can be part of that blend as well. But overall, globally, ethanol production is forecast down about 20% in 2020. Excuse me, and not just the U.S. See the U.S. here in the gold on the bottom, but other areas, production areas, Latin America, which would be predominantly Brazil, but that's also going to see some Argentine, Colombia, Peru, ethanol production in there. And this is projecting what they think that we're going to take, almost out to 2022 to get back to where we were pre-COVID. And so obviously COVID has taken a big hit on ethanol use, as it's taken a big hit on gasoline use for transportation, as people are locked down and not driving as much. And so that's not just the US, but also affects our international markets. But we're seeing some places bounce back even faster than others. China seems to be bouncing back much faster than other places. And but overall, we can see, ethanol production just down because of COVID-19, and going to take a good 2 years for us to get back to where we were. Looking into the corn situation, look at the top markets for U.S. corn for the 2019-20 marketing year. That marketing year, just ended here at the end of August. Mexico remained our #1 customer, at just over 14 million tons. Japan #2, Colombia 3, and South Korea 4. But China has moved into our top 5 with the large amounts of corn they started to buy here, mainly I would say June, July, even in August, and kicked Canada out of the top 5. And so China is now into our top 5 markets as we look at the 2019-20 crop year. Overall, corn exports for 2019-20 marketing year were down about 12%, even though we had some very strong export months here, basically even I'd say May, June, July, and August. We really had really tough competition from Brazil when we look at the beginning of that marketing year. So last October, November, December, even into January, really strong competition from Brazil there. So even though we had some very strong export months towards the end of the marketing year, we're still down overall 12% in 1920 versus the prior year. But saying that, we'll take a look at what's happened so far in the new marketing year, the 2020-21 marketing year that started on September 1st. You can see here, China has just dominated that and is now, at least so far, the largest buyer of U.S. corn. So these numbers are a combination of both sales and shipments from USDA's export sales report through September 10th, but it includes some spot sales that have been announced on the since that started. And so we do see very strong sales, almost 10 million tons of corn exports on the books, and some of that's already been shipped even to China. Mexico, our typical #1, and I'm sure they will continue to buy throughout the year, as well as Japan. But just a really strong start from China. Just to show you what, in perspective, what that means, and here I took the time and converted the numbers into millions of bushels. And so in USDA's latest WASDA report, they have total U.S. exports at 2.325 billion bushels for the 2020-21 marketing year. If I look at what we've sold and shipped so far, just through mid-September, we've already sold and shipped over a third, almost 37% of what USDA says we will export, and almost 17% of that from China. 391 million bushels of corn already sold, and some of that shipped to China. So very strong start to the the new marketing year, and the USDA actually increased exports quite a bit over a year ago, and even increased it 100 million bushels here in September over the August report. And so a much higher, a very fast start off from what USDA expects to be a very large year. We'll have to see in the October report if they make any projections or increases in this. I do know that this number here, USDA actually currently has China, and in their report currently has China only importing 275 million bushel, and we've already sold and shipped them 391 million bushels. So there's definitely going to have to be some kind of an adjustment by USDA in their October numbers, that, at least for China. Whether they adjust the overall projection up as well, we'll have to see. So what's behind this strong import demand from China? Obviously, most people will point to China in phase one, talk a little bit about what has and what hasn't changed as we started phase one, which was signed back January 15th, 2020, and officially I think took effect February 14th, 2020. And then obviously shortly after that, the world started to shut down because of COVID-19. But just kind of a review of what has and hasn't changed. And so the 301 retaliatory tariffs of basically 25% on lots of different U.S. agricultural products have not been removed by China, but they do allow for importers to apply for those tariff exemptions. So as a China importer, I can go out and apply for a 301 tariff exemption so that I don't have to pay that 25%. And those exemptions are being given out quite freely and easily, so it's not much of a problem to get those. Because of the tariff rate quota, the TRQ that China has on corn, nearly all of the U.S. corn that's been imported so far is by state organization or state enterprises, so state trading companies in China, where sorghum is more freely traded because there's not a tariff rate quota in sorghum. And I'll show you some sorghum numbers here in a second. But so the private sector, the private corn and the feed grain importers and users are able to buy and use sorghum whenever they want. Right now, it's the corn imports and buying is being dominated by the one big state-run company, grain importer in China. As we look at other issues, the anti-dumping and countervailing duty, this AD/CVD case on DDGS is still in place in China. Continuing to push on that, but that's still in place, and so that basically on average is about an 80% import tariff on DDGS, which makes it very difficult, if not impossible, to trade. The 231 retaliatory tariffs are still of 15% are still in place on ethanol. I think it also covers pork as well. Plus ethanol has a MFN rate or a base rate of 30%. So even if I get the 301 exemption on ethanol, I still have to pay about or 45% import duty with the 231 retaliatory tariff plus the base rate for ethanol. And so that 45% duty is really limited, or basically seeing no sales of U.S. ethanol into China because of that. One big thing that's really been a benefit of the phase one deal, a lot of the technical issues that were resolved that have allowed for U.S. agriculture products to be able to move into China. And on the feed grain side, biotech approval, we pretty much have all the events now approved in China. That's supposed to continue that way. I see Brent's on here. He can tell me whether he expects that to continue that way. Biotech processing license for imported corn use by feed mills, that whole process has been improved. The registration of ethanol plants for DDGS has been improved and is moving much faster. And we've created a new protocol for U.S. barley exports to China. So now barley can be shipped to China as well. Next, this is my chart, and I update it weekly. Phase one, what have we actually sold to China And I actually look at the full marketing year, not necessarily just the calendar year, although most of this business has taken place since the phase one deal was put into place. And so if we look at 2019 and 20 marketing year, we can see, 83 million bushels of corn and about 154 or over 154 million bushels of sorghum was sold and shipped to China. Again, this fast start of over 391 million bushels of corn to China, and over 60 million bushels of sorghum that's been sold and or shipped to China in the new marketing year. In addition to that, if I start to look at the amount of sales that have been reported to unknown destinations, right now we have over 3 million tons of corn listed as sold to unknown destinations. Most people assume a lot of that, or a big chunk of that, is China. So even if we say 50% of that, that's another 1.5 million tons of corn, most likely going to China. And then almost another 1 million tons of sorghum sold to unknown destinations. And at today's prices, I can almost assure that that's nearly 100% of that additional sorghum to unknown is going to be headed to China as well. What's behind all of this? Why, besides the phase one, and I'll say for China to be buying that amount of corn from the U.S., it's not just a phase one deal. There's lots of things going on inside of China, specifically around corn price, that's driving this. This is a busy chart that shows a lot of things, but this gold bar down the center, right around in April of 2016, is when China started changed their corn support policy, basically putting no support prices in the northeast area of China. You can kind of see what prices have done. So the red line, that's corn cash price in Changchun, China, way up in the northeast, kind of the center of their main corn producing area. The green line is Chinese corn delivered to Shekou port, the main port in southern China. And we see a lot of corn that will move from northeast China into southern China to meet that demand. And then the blue line here is what U.S. corn exported to Shekou port, adding all of the different import duties and value-added taxes that I would need to pay to give you a comparison. And I put this chart in dollars per bushel, so you can see right now, Changchun corn cash price is about $8.68, $8.70 a bushel. Corn delivered from northeast China into southern China, probably around $9 a bushel. And I can deliver U.S. corn probably about $6.70 a bushel. And here we can see where the retaliatory tariffs were put into place in the summer of 2018, where you can see that basically a 25% increase in the blue line. And then starting here in February, when importers could apply for the tariff exemption, basically taking that 25% tariff back off. And so you can see this huge spread, even though U.S. corn has come back up. And we've seen Chinese corn domestically come back up the last 2 weeks as well. That's about a $90 a ton gap, about $2.50, $2.75 a bushel gap between what I can bring imported corn in versus domestic corn. And so those kind of prices are really what's driving the strong demand from China, in addition to what we see here with trying to meet the phase one agreement. And obviously the strong soybean demand from China is building along with that. And so, I saw this morning there was some additional soybean sales announcements to China. It's almost every morning we have corn or soybeans or both announcements for China. So it's good to see, and it's creating some strong demand and some strong basis prices in certain areas of the U.S. switch over and talk a little bit about Mexico, the other big market I was going to talk about this morning. Mexico, obviously, quite our very important market for us. Our largest corn export market. Have to see if they continue or if China ends up taking over #1 spot. But right now, I would say Mexico will continue to be our #1 corn export market for this marketing year. It's our #1 DDGS export market. If you're a barley farmer at all, it's our #1 barley and barley malt export market, second largest sorghum export market, and growing potential for ethanol exports. And you can see pictured here is Mexico President Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, better known as AMLO, a man who thinks of himself as president of the people. Here he is. I think this is the first time he was seen out in public wearing a mask, but he's actually flying commercial flights. This is on a Delta flight from Mexico City to Atlanta and then connect to DC to come up and actually sign the USMCA. So he really wants to show that he's a man of the people, and so he flies commercial, taking connecting flights and everything just to get to DC to sign the USMCA. But with that, I'll talk about USMCA and even some of the issues we've seen in some of the recent hiccups we've seen from AMLO and his cabinet. So USMCA, again, the agreement went into effect back in July. It's a great template for future trade agreements. All of the SBS and precautionary, all those kind of elements of it. It's really a great template for future trade agreements, whether we're talking about the free trade agreement talks underway with Kenya or UK or other places. But even though we just signed this back in July, we already have some disagreements, particularly with Mexico, and we'll really test how this agreement holds up throughout this. AMLO, he ran on a ticket of being very much a man of the people, wanting to reduce chemical and pesticide use, and so because of that, they've had talks about a ban on glyphosate imports and glyphosate use, which then has us worried even what would MRLs, minimum residue levels on imported grains into Mexico be. Huge delay in biotech approvals now in Mexico. In addition to that, here in the last couple of weeks, there's been discussion. The outgoing environmental minister made comments about banning GMOs into Mexico. No real definition of that. It's already banned to cultivate any GMO corn in Mexico, but a lot of discussion of does that include even imports, and is that imports for food use or feed use or both? And so a lot of confusion around that, along with the various bans on glyphosate and other pesticides. But then even on the US side, the seasonal produce issue, we have certain small areas, tomatoes down in Florida, small areas of blueberries are asking the US to set up seasonal produce so that you have either very high tariffs or a complete shutdown of imports during certain parts of the season, obviously when their harvest season is, to protect prices here in Mexico. If the US goes forward with that, we will most very likely see Mexico reciprocate. And obviously corn would be one easy thing for them to hit, or corn products, whether that's DDGS, high fructose corn syrup, other things. We did have the aluminum tariff issue in Canada. All that seems to have been worked out here now in the last few days. Talk about besides already a big feed grain market for us, we have a lot of hope for ethanol in Mexico. But what we've really seen here just lately is what hand sanitizer and other sanitizer use is done for ethanol demand in Mexico. April became the largest volume of U.S. ethanol imports by Mexico, over 50 million gallons, up from 3 million gallon a month average. Seen a blend of both old and new players taking part in the hand sanitizer use. And we're using that as a way of encouraging companies to establish supply networks and logistics to bring in ethanol that could then even be transitioned into fuel ethanol business, including blending infrastructures. Because we do know there is some blended gasoline that does get moved by truck already, that already contains ethanol into Mexico, especially around in the northern Mexico region. And it's hard for us to really track how much of that is actually happening. But even with the ethanol going in for hand sanitizers, again, using that to help start supply networks and logistics that can be in place for when we do see a big increase in fuel demand for ethanol in Mexico. Here, just a quick look of those numbers of monthly imports of undenatured in green, and denatured in blue. And so you can see a very, very large increase in April, and that continued, not quite as large, but continued strong demand in April and June for undenatured, and we know most of that is going for sanitizer use. At the same time, here the June numbers showed this gray bar, that's Brazilian ethanol. So we see the Mexicans buying some Brazilian ethanol for sanitizer use as well. So, but you know, our big hopes are in Mexico are on the fuel ethanol side. And so Ryan LeGrand, our CEO, back when he was our Mexico director, spent a good probably even 3 years really pushing to get E10 set for Mexico, not necessarily a mandate, but just allowed for blending of 10% ethanol throughout Mexico. And so the CRE, which is the Energy Regulatory Commission in Mexico, had agreed to set up that. But here, back in early 2020, the Supreme Court decided that there was not enough, they didn't quite follow the right procedures and had decided to revert back to the 5.8% level rather than the 10%. That 10% is still extended as they work through this case in the Supreme Court, and obviously COVID-19 has made that quite difficult to do. The court has not been hearing cases, and so there's lots of work behind the scenes going on, but we're not quite sure when we will get an answer to that. But in the meantime, the Grains Council has been working quite hard. We have a working group of both key people in Mexico and the U.S., including Grain Council staff, U.S. People for both growth and RFA are part of that working group, as well as some of the ethanol producers in the U.S. Working on it. We've put together a Turner Mason study to really show the benefits of 10% blending of ethanol into Mexico market, and shows how, you know, by doing that, Mexico would save $148 million a year just in Mexico City alone by blending 10% ethanol as a replacement of other oxygenates. And so there's a big push on that, and very similar to, you know, probably what the U.S. went through years back to get ethanol approved. We're seeing very similar things going on in Mexico. Pemex, the longtime petroleum company, state-owned company in Mexico that used to have complete monopoly on the gasoline side of things, which they don't anymore. But they're at first had been very reluctant, as most petroleum companies are globally, against ethanol. But there are some areas of Pemex that are starting to see the benefit, including this $148 million savings for a company that's about, I can't remember how many, $4 or $5 billion in debt, could start be saving. And so we're starting to see some interest even from Pemex on E10. But we're still fighting the battle in the Supreme Court, and lots of discussion going on government to government wise, even on all this. And it's the key area that the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City is working with us to push this forward as we move forward with the USMCA. To finish up, I'll just point out a couple of other world successes that we've had here in the last year. October of 2019, we had our Global Ethanol Summit here in Washington, D.C. Again, we're following that up with an actual buyers conference, virtual ethanol buyers conference that's taking place today. We were able to fight and end the countervailing duty case against U.S. corn in Peru. A big win for us to keep, and that was a self-initiated, the Peruvian government put a countervailing duty case on U.S. corn, and we were able to fight that and actually win one of these CVD cases here. Our Kurt Schultz and our staff have started this U.S. corn starch study. We're about halfway into that, but literally we're looking and showing how starch recovery and corn wet milling and how much better, almost a 3% increase starch yield from U.S. corn over South American or Black Sea origin corn, and working to get that data put out as we look to initiate to get buyers a reason to be buying U.S. corn, as they always tend to be price shoppers and or complaining about quality issues where we can show them there is a reason to be buying U.S. corn because of that 3% increased starch yield in your corn wet mills globally. Had a big Middle East Africa Buyers Conference a year ago. Mentioned before the Japanese ethanol purchases in the form of ETBE. Here recently, we were even able to get the gasoline number that they developed that equation on increased, and so now it used to be U.S. ethanol could make up 44% of the ETBE that went in Japan. Now under that new change of on the gasoline baseline, which just took place here at the end of August, that now moves up to a 66% U.S. market share can be part of that. And so we'll continue to see increased use of ethanol through ETBE into the Japanese market. And Southeast Asia DDGS sales, we just really seen markets, Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, really take off. But when you add the Philippines, even Myanmar, Cambodia into that, just a very strong demand for DDGS into that Southeast Asia market, predominantly going there by container. And to finish off, just to bring this back home to you in Colorado, trade impacts every farmer. This is all important to corn growers in Colorado and across the U.S. because we still have, USDA is still predicting a 2.5 billion bushel carryout. And we need to continue to work to drive exports to ship corn outside of our borders in all forms, whether that's corn, ethanol, DDGS, pork, beef. We need to strive to continue to see, build markets to move corn in all forms out of the U.S. to work on that, lowering that 2.5 billion bushel carryout, which then obviously will have an effect on prices. But we continue to see strong competition from Brazil and Argentina and Ukraine. And so we need to be continuing working on developing markets for corn. We could DDGS and ethanol. We even see competition on ethanol side. We see with some Brazilian ethanol even going into Mexico. And so really appreciate the support of Colorado Corn to the U.S. Grain Council to allow us to continue to develop markets, enable trade, and improve lives. So with that, I'll take any questions anybody has.
Well, thank you very much, Cary. That was a lot of information to digest, and it just goes to show how much work you and your staff and the United States Grains Council are doing around the world to promote United States grains and their derivatives to help increase demand for our products. So thank you so much for your work. And that was a lot to digest right there. I'll kick things off with a quick question. I don't see any questions in the chat, but I will start bringing people online so that they have something they can ask. But
Sure.
I want to go back to last week, where we saw the ambassador to China, Terry Branstad, resign after he published an op-ed kind of scathing towards China. What is that going to do to our short term? You mentioned a lot of trade with China based on price. We have the phase 1 deal. What is that going to do to our relationship and trade relationship with China short term and also long term, as we kind of see that he blames them for a lot of the issues that we're facing in terms of access and reciprocation?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, Governor Branstad's been a former governor of Iowa, great supporter, obviously, of U.S. ag trade, but even and has been very outspoken and willing to help us as we try to develop the ethanol market there in China as well. And so losing that voice on the ground for us there in China will be a big loss. I know they've sent a lot of the diplomats, State Department, but even on the USDA, on the ag side of things, sending those guys back to Beijing and the other outposts throughout China. And so they're quite, obviously China is hugely important relationship between U.S. and China, whether that's ag trade, whether that's even security issues, property issues. So they're working quite hard to get diplomats back into place. How quickly a new ambassador will be announced and put into place, obviously, I would assume that would be after the elections. It's possible that President Trump nominates somebody and gets them approved before election, but I don't know whether that would happen. But yeah, that's a key voice for us. Corn ethanol. He's been very outspoken, even on trying to get the AD CVD cases dropped on DDGS, and so that's a big loss for us. I think, but we still do have very capable, USDA has very capable staff on the ground, and we're working to get Brian Lomar, our director. He's been back here in the U.S. Since late January, and finally got his visa approved, and we're working to get him back into Beijing and on the ground ourselves here in the coming weeks. But our other staff have been on the ground working on issues as they can throughout the COVID-19 period.
Awesome. Thank you, Cary. We have a question from Kim Redden. She said, you mentioned that it would take 2 years to rebuild the ethanol market. She's curious how you came to this conclusion and if there are anything that the industry, corn and ethanol, can do to help that along. Those are the numbers I've been told. I'm hopeful it doesn't take that long, that it does bounce back. I think just the transportation fuel demand, I think, is going to take time to come back. And not just U.S. Other markets, Mexico, Brazil, China, Japan. As you have, obviously lots of people working from home, and some people deciding, well, whether it's people or even companies deciding, well, we can manage this. We don't need our 1,500 staff driving into the office every day. Maybe maybe we do everything virtually. So you've got those kind of things that have changed in the U.S. and other places that I think are just going to continue to be an overall effect on fuel demand, and which then obviously affects blending of ethanol. Now, if and I know NCGA does the work on the domestic side, but the push to E15 and higher blends, and we're doing that as well in some international markets as well, so that you're blending a higher rate and not having to worry just as the overall fuel demand increasing to bring it back. But I think that's the basis behind those numbers, that the overall transportation fuel demand is just going to take time to come back to that pre-COVID level.
Thanks, Cary.
Sure.
Yeah, I think CoBank actually put something out to that regard as well. Is it's just going to take some time to get people back on the road. I guess it's time to reinitiate the Great American Road Trip.
Yes.
So, I don't see any questions from anyone yet, but I do have some others that I could ask. But if you do have a question, don't be afraid to unmute yourself and jump in here with any questions you have for Cary regarding what they're doing at the United States Grains Council. But one thing that I'll ask on is recently the U.S. Grains Council put out a study on oxygenator tariffs that are around the world and kind of compared it to ethanol, xylitol, and MTBE. And it seemed it puts ethanol at a significant disadvantage. What are we, or how are we able to get ethanol put into parity with those other oxygenators? What would be the benefit if you see ethanol instead of MTBE or some of those others that go into oxygenated ethanol, and what would that do for our markets in terms of product placement and expansion?
Well, I mean, that's why we did this study. That's very key. You've got markets. I'll pick out Vietnam and Indonesia, even, and I know there's others out there. In Vietnam, we pushed them. We wanted them to take the ethanol import duty from 20% down to 5%, and that was part of a big U.S. government to Vietnam government discussion. They agreed to bring it down to 15%, but all the other oxygenates are still at 5%. So we're all we're asking is to put ethanol at the same level as other oxygenates, and ethanol is a much safer for the environment and even for humans to work with than some of these other oxygenates that are out there. And so if you have all the tariffs, Vietnam or in Indonesia or China or wherever, if they have all those oxygenates at the same tariff level, then they can compete on what's the world marketplace doing on MTBE versus ethanol and other oxygenates, and not for ethanol to have a huge price decline versus MTBE to be able to make a run into a certain market, whether it's Indonesia or China as an oxygenate. And so that's why we're asking for those level playing fields. And so and it's all part of our global policy push everywhere. And so that's really going to make a difference on ethanol if people start to look and say, well, it doesn't cost me more tariff to use ethanol versus other oxygenates, and so I don't necessarily need a E10 mandate in Indonesia to use it. If it's cost competitive against other oxygenates and the tariff levels are the same, I start to use it just because of the economics of it, not necessarily because I have a E10 mandate and those kind of things. It'd be great to have mandates, but those things aren't so easy to always come by. And you have obviously big fights with the petroleum industry globally when you start trying to do that. So,
yes. So we have time for maybe a couple more questions. I want to see if anybody from the audience, I see a few people unmuted, if they have some questions to ask Cary.
Yeah, Cary, can you hear me?
yep.
With our problems that we're having with China, how does that affect our growing exports to the nations around there, like the DDGS and ethanol to Vietnam and the Philippines and South Korea and those type of countries? What kind of tightrope are we walking trying to not tee off people?
I don't know that we're I don't know if anybody's getting mad yet, but you're definitely seeing, with the very, very strong soybean demand and now corn demand for China. If I wanted to, if I'm Taiwan or I'm South Korea and I want to buy a vessel of U.S. corn for last half December shipment out of the U.S. Gulf, New Orleans area, I wouldn't say it's impossible to find it, but because of the very strong lineup of exports of both corn and soybeans to China, those elevation costs are quite high. And so that's, I wouldn't say we're squeezing out completely, but we're definitely using up a lot of our logistics right now to move corn and soybeans over the next 3 or 4 months to China. And so the days, and there are markets who do this, who call up and start pricing, and they want to price a vessel of corn to be shipped next week. those kind of things are going to be difficult. Now the West has probably more options, although there'll be a fair amount of beans to China being shipped out of the Pacific Northwest. But then you're going to start to see markets that can ship, whether it's off the lakes, so we're loading vessels in Toledo or Milwaukee, or off the West Coast where we're loading vessels in Norfolk, Virginia. We expect to see a very strong container market demand with trade coming back, and even the U.S. economy coming back to some degree. China, a lot more movement of containers. When COVID first came out, there was actually quite a bit of shortage of containers, and then we had the ethanol industry shut down. We even had a shortage of DDGS. The ethanol industry, it's not back 100%, but we're at least producing decent levels, so there's good amount of production of DDGS to meet those demand. And that Southeast Asia market, even in South Korea, that's a 1 million ton market for DDGS, they predominantly take it in containers. You could see markets like Taiwan or Korea start to load corn in containers, whether you're loading corn in Joliet, Illinois, or Omaha, or Kansas City, or wherever. I think we'll start to see people get quite creative that way, as we see, the river system, barges, and then thus vessels and loading windows in the ports down in the New Orleans area filling up throughout the rest of 2020, and probably even now starting into the first month or two of 2021.
All right, well, we are about 3 minutes over, and if you don't mind sticking around, Cary, we could probably take one more question if there's any
Sure.
out. But if you need to hop off, we totally understand.
Nope, I got time for a question or two if they're out there.
Is there any more questions from the audience before we wrap this up?
Nick, this is Troy. Not a question necessarily, but just a statement for Cary. Just want to thank you for your time and your years of service to the Grains Council. I was kind of taken aback. I'd forgotten all the places you'd been to and service through the years. So I just wanted to take a moment and thank you for that.
Well, thanks, Troy. I mean, it's been quite an experience, and to be able to work in 4 different of our international offices and out back here in DC. But it's the producers that you're representing, whether I'm here sitting at a desk in DC or overseas in Japan or China or somewhere. Knowing you're representing the good-hearted people of the corn and soybean, corn, sorghum, and barley producers back in the U.S. It's what keeps you going every day. So it's easy to get up and work for knowing that you're supporting the good producer. And I'm a farm boy from Minnesota myself, so I know the type of people that you're supporting when you're out there doing your work. So.
All right. Well, any last questions before we wrap this up? Well, thank you everyone for joining us this morning. We really appreciate you giving us an hour of your time, a little bit, an hour and 4 minutes of your time this morning. And Cary, thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. There was a lot in there, and it just goes to show how much work that you and the United States Grains Council staff are doing on behalf of the American farmer to find a market for what we produce so that we can make a living and help keep our rural communities strong as we move through this. And so thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. And hopefully you'll have a great day.